victims. And I just want to say to anybody listening to this that your sexual assault or someone else's sexual assault is not your fault. Mm-hmm. That is the fault of the offender and the offender only. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, some people might say, well, yeah, I consented, but the law may not agree that you have if you're 12, and some people who experience child sexual abuse were made to feel at an early age that they were consenting to sexual activity with someone who was abusing them when in fact they were not and could not.
It's not uncommon where a church leadership will be sitting on the offender side, will be supporting the offender through a criminal case, and the victim side will be very, very sparse. There will be very few people there present, especially from the church or a faith setting. I'm hopeful that that's changing over the years, but as church leadership, it's very important that when a disclosure of sexual assault is made, that the victim is believed and that they are encouraged and told that they will be supported through the process in whatever way they choose.
Because sexual assault takes away choice from a person, takes away power, takes away their voice. It's so important for survivors to reclaim that in the way that's best for them. And part of that can be in making a report of their sexual assault, and some of that could be in deciding not to for a variety of reasons.
Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for a Grace Live conversation. My name is Pete Singer. I'm the Executive Director over here at Grace. Grace stands for Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment. And we've been working since 2004, coming alongside Christian faith communities to better recognize, prevent, and respond to abuse. We do that through education of churches, and both leadership and entire congregations, through help with policy development and policy review, through real-time consultations when churches learn of allegations or other areas of concern where they need some help related to abuse prevention and response, and then also through investigations and assessments to assist with accountability when that is required. Last month, we had a Grace Live conversation on non-disclosure and non-disparagement agreements. We had a couple of great guests, Scott McKnight and Boz Chividjian, who helped us to better understand non-disclosure and non-disparagement agreements in the context of abuse and the church. If you missed that, or if you would be interested in viewing it again, please go to our YouTube page. And at our YouTube page, you'll find that all of our past Grace Live conversations are included, and you can view them for free. It's a great way to help people learn about abuse in the church, abuse in faith contexts. Today, our Grace Live conversation is on non-clergy adult sexual assault. This is obviously a very heavy topic. Please take care of yourself during this program. Taking care of yourself might involve doing different self-care tasks or routines that you have, like deep breathing or sitting up straight with your feet flat on the ground, holding something warm in your hands or a weight in your lap that can be grounding. There may be other things like prayer or other practices that you find helpful. So please engage in those throughout the program. You may find that that's adequate. You may find that that's not. So please know that it is also 100% fine to step away from the program at any point that you might need to. You're not going to miss anything because you'll be able to watch the program on YouTube later. So please know that you can step away from the program if you need to. We are honored today to have two incredible guests, experts in this area that I am honored to be able to work with. Laura Teen and Amy Steer. Laura is a licensed social worker in clinical practice at a rape crisis center and NCA accredited children's advocacy center. She's been working with survivors of child abuse, sexual assault, and other trauma for over 16 years in a variety of capacities, including adoptions, foster care, and clinical practice. Much of that time has coincided with advocacy work in the faith community for better prevention, education, congregational care, and collaboration with the child protection community. Laura has a master's of social work and is a licensed independent social worker of clinical practice. She's trained in trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, eye movement and desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR, and accelerated resolution therapy. She serves as a member of Grace's board of directors. Amy Steer has over 10 years experience in high-profile child abuse and adult sexual misconduct investigations, largely through her work with Grace, but also as a contractor working in Title IX university settings. Amy has experience leading a number of investigations, conducting policy audits and providing training and education for a range of institutions, including universities, churches, mission boards, and other faith-based organizations from a wide range of denominational backgrounds and sizes. Amy has her own consulting company, Amy Steer LLC. She is also a founding law partner of the Steer Group, PLLC. Amy is a licensed attorney admitted to practice by the Texas State Bar and Supreme Court Bar. Laura and Amy, we are thrilled and honored to have you both with us today.
Thank you, Pete.
Thank you.
You bet. Well, as we get into this conversation today and we start talking about non-clergy adult sexual assault, one of the things that is really important is that we enter into the conversation with a shared understanding of what we're discussing. So just even as we start this conversation, would you be able to help us understand what do we mean by sexual assault?
You're right, Pete. I think this is so important because a lot of the time when we use different phrases, they can get confused, or people think a lot of different phrases mean actually the same thing. When we talk about sexual assault as a whole, we're actually talking about a fairly broad category that includes many of the things and many of the acts that people may come to people's minds initially. But sexual assault in and of itself refers to any sexual contact or behavior that occurs without the explicit consent of the recipient. So any sexual contact without the consent of the recipient or the victim. So, there's a definition of that here in the chat from the RAIN website, and really it is a fairly broad category. And so as we think about talking about adult sexual assault, what we're saying is we're going to focus in on what happens when we're working with those over the age of 18, and things that may occur for folks when they are older than a minor child. So I think in the past, there have been some Grace Lives around specifically child sexual abuse. Child sexual abuse is under that umbrella of sexual assault, but it is a more particular category of sexual assault.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks. It's so important to have a shared understanding of what we're talking about when we have these conversations.
Mm-hmm. And some example, I don't know if it's helpful, Pete, to give a few examples, but
yeah, that'd be great.
Again, as I say these examples, I know that even just hearing some of these things might be difficult for people. So I want to affirm Pete's recommendation to definitely take care of yourselves throughout this webinar. But it can involve anything from unwanted sexual touch, groping, fondling, kissing. It can involve any kind of penetration, attempted rape or rape itself, any forcing of a victim to perform sexual acts, and anything under those examples would be considered sexual assault.
All right. So it's broad, and that's really important that we understand that it isn't limited to one or two specific extreme things.
Mm-hmm.
All of it is a sexual assault, all of those things that you listed.
Mm-hmm.
one of the key components of that, as you were giving those examples and as you were giving that definition, was this idea of consent, that it's something that's done to you without your consent. Can you help us understand consent?
Sure. This is Amy. I'm just going to talk briefly about consent and just piggyback on what Laura and Pete just said, is that it's important that any allegations of non-consensual sexual contact is taken seriously. In that when someone makes a disclosure of something that's non-consensual sexual contact, that they are believed and that they are cared for. And so consent is really, when you're talking about a sexual assault in the legal sphere, what most people are looking at is, was there consent? And so consent is an agreement between participants to engage in sexual activity. And so consent is very misunderstood in our culture, but also especially in Christian circles, about what consent is. And so just broadly, consent should be freely given. It should be informed, and it is reversible. So that means consent to one act does not mean consent to another. It's not given under intimidation, coercion, or under duress. And another important piece about this is that consent cannot be given by individuals who are underage, meaning they're minors, intoxicated or incapacitated by drugs or alcohol, or asleep and unconscious. And so it's really looking for a yes instead of an absence of no. There's a short consent video that I think they're going to post in the chat. It's called the tea bag, the tea bag example. And really, this is used a lot in training to really inform individuals what consent is. It's also used a lot in colleges to train students about what consent is. And so it's a really informative video. I'd encourage you to watch it on your own time, and also to practice self-care when you're going back and reviewing these materials. And so that's kind of broadly what consent is. It can be more nuanced, but those are just some basics. I think it's really important that when we're talking about consent, that we break away from gender roles and gender roles. I think that, any partner might want to engage or not engage in a certain sexual activity. And so I just want to briefly say that, but I think that's really important too.
And I think, the freely given aspect is so important. The idea that freely given means that you are giving consent to this and agreeing to this sexual act, not under any kind of threat, not under intimidation or coercion or pouting or bullying or any manipulation. And I think sometimes when we think about that, it gives us an opportunity to consider, sometimes even the ways that we ask for consent may unintentionally, put pressure on someone. And a lot of times I don't even think that that's necessarily purposeful, but I think sometimes in thinking about the definition of what does it mean, we can think about it not just from a person who needs to give consent, but from a person who needs to ask for consent as well, which I think is important to highlight. And then it, like you said, Amy, it needs to be informed. The person needs to know what they're agreeing to, right? And if what they're agreeing to shifts or changes along the way, there needs to be a re-agreement. They need to know that this is what's happening, what may happen, and that at any time they can say, I'm not comfortable with that, or I'm not ready for that, or that's not something I want to do right now. So knowing what you're agreeing to is really important, and knowing that at any time you can agree to something, and then if it becomes uncomfortable for any reason, or if it becomes something you decide, I really actually don't want to participate in this, that I can say, I don't want to do that, and that no is respected. And so when we talk about respecting the no, that's what we mean. When someone withdraws their consent or says no in the beginning, that we're really respecting that person's their agency and respecting the consent that they're not giving in that process. So,
and just one more quick note about that, Laura, that's so important what you just said, that consent, I think that there's a misunderstanding too of what consent is not. It's not flirting. It's not silence. It's not based upon what anybody is wearing. And I think that sometimes especially I've seen this a lot in investigations that I've done in Christian institutions where, some of those things that maybe initially, and people's initial reactions, comments about what someone was wearing, comments about, well, they were drinking, or comments about flirting or silence, really what that is victim blaming language. And what that does is it's really harmful because it prevents individuals from coming forward with allegations and from reporting it. And so what you mentioned is so important, that it's freely given, that it's informed, and also that, like you mentioned, Laura, that it's done in a way where there's a mutual respect. And when someone withdraws their consent, that it is respected.
Absolutely. And just because you agree and consent to a sexual act at one point doesn't mean that that is a carte blanche for that same sexual act or other sexual activity going forward. And I think sometimes you're like, oh, well, we did it, so now therefore, this is kind of what we do now. But the reality is that consent is an ongoing process. It's not a matter of a moment of consent and then that's the consent that we need. It's ongoing, and that's part of it being informed, right? I'm informed because I am making an agreement. I'm communicating that agreement about this particular act in this moment based on these circumstances, right? So I think that's important to remember as well.
Yeah, those are so important. I mean, recognizing that it is reversible, recognizing that you never owe consent to anyone, that both people involved in a relationship, if there's a relationship that's there, both of those people are due respect. That if we treat a person with respect, then we actually will care, we will pay attention, and our focus will be, it won't have to be a grudging thing to accept a no. Because we respect and we love and we care for the other person.
Absolutely. I think legal definitions of consent are going to vary a little bit state by state based on the laws, but the laws, when they look at consent and not consent for when they're determining, has a sexual crime occurred, as Amy already mentioned, they look at, what is the age of the victim? Is there a power differential? Is there a relationship that we need to consider where that person may not be able to consent due to that power dynamic? Is it this person a vulnerable adult? Are they potentially incapacitated around consent due to illness or mental capacity, cognitive ability? What are they conscious? Were they conscious when this happened? I mean, consciousness is the most foundational level of, what we should be looking at. But were they asleep? Were they conscious? Were they intoxicated or under the influence? And in a lot of states, if the answer is they weren't awake and they weren't conscious and they were under the influence for whatever the reason may be, they don't have the capacity to consent. So there's a lot of factors that the laws will look at as well from state to state around capacity to consent. Because some people might say, well, yeah, I consented, but the law may not agree that you have if you're 12, and some people who experience child sexual abuse were made to feel at an early age that they were consenting to sexual activity with someone who was abusing them when in fact they were not and could not.
Those are all super, super important points. One of the things that you had mentioned early on as you were talking, Amy, is this idea of gender roles and expectations or assumptions around that, which got me thinking it's actually really important that we ask this question, who does sexual assault actually impact?
Sure. Statistics state that nationwide 81% of women and 43% of men reported experiencing some form of sexual harassment and or assault in their lifetime. So those statistics are really staggering. So it can affect men or women. It can affect family members, spouses, friends, neighbors, peers, coworkers, college students. I've done a lot of work in Title IX, so I saw a lot of sexual assaults on college campuses. Military personnel can also affect those that are incarcerated. I really want to just take a moment right now to highlight that this does happen in marriage. Sexual assault can occur in marriage and intimate partner relationships. So that could be a dating relationship. And that the bulk of sexual assaults occur by somebody that an individual knows. I believe it's a very small percentage where sexual assault occurs by a stranger, that most sexual assaults occur by either an acquaintance or someone that they're very close to, such as an intimate partner. When I say intimate partner, that's someone that an individual is in a relationship with. An intimate partner could be a dating relationship, it could be a marriage as well. And so the statistics actually say, kind of going back to sexual assault in marriage, states that 10 to 14% of all marriages, there's sexual assault occurs in 10 to 14% of all marriages. And so that statistic, I think specifically for churches, should be very startling. And, we can talk about indicators to help when someone is actually making a disclosure of a sexual assault in a marriage, which might look a little different than other forms. It might look the same, but it might look different. But then the statistics also show that sexual assault or forced sex occurs in approximately 40 to 45% of marriages that have involved verbal or physical violence. So where there's other forms of violence, there's more likely to be sexual violence as well. It can really affect anybody, Pete. I think that's really important for us to know. I've no doubt that we all, if we've experienced it ourselves or if we haven't, we all know somebody who has. And so really, it's really important to really understand these statistics and understand how to respond to sexual assault so that we can really come alongside and care for those that we know who have experienced it.
Mm-hmm. And Amy, one of the more underreported populations is men. We know this to be true with child sexual abuse as well as adult sexual assault for a variety of reasons, whether it's shame or concern about appearance of what that might mean for them or look like within their communities, or they may feel that due to their beliefs about masculinity, that's being challenged in a way that they find harmful or unhelpful. And so, you want to acknowledge that, many times we are working with women when we talk about adult sexual assault, but it does happen with men, and there are resources available. And that this can, again, like you said, occur within marriage, but also in many other situations. And so I think within the last 10 to 20 years, more research and more resources have become available than ever before. But I think we're also going to be putting some resources. I think 1 in 6 is one of the organizations working specifically with male survivors. And so if you're a male survivor looking for male specific resources, just know that we'll be putting some of those out there for you as well.
That's a great point, Laura. And I also would like to just mention that when we're talking about offenders of sexual assault, those who commit the act and the crime can also be male or female. So
Absolutely.
Many statistics show that sexual offenders are usually male, but just like research is starting to get more about male victims, there's more research coming out about female offenders. And so I think that's really important for people to notate. I think sometimes when someone discloses that there's been a sexual assault, kind of like those gender lines we typically go down, it also happens when there's a disclosure. If someone discloses that a female abused them, it's like instantly someone's mind might go to disbelief because it doesn't fit in your normal kind of framework of a statistic. And so I think it's really important that we all kind of recognize and become aware of these things, because it can really affect how we respond to disclosures of sexual assaults.
Right. And I think sometimes people don't recognize that there's some maybe traditionally or good old boys sort of accepted behavior between males, like horsing around or, some physical contact or things that can become sexual that people kind of feel very taken aback or blindsided by, in their experiences that can cause them to have a lot of confusion around that. So even like the cultures within, churches and institutions, our broader society around even like what kind of devolves quickly, what can be a red flag when we think about some interactions and environments. I think there are a lot of conversations to be had around that and how people can understand more about the risks of that and how those things can be red flags. And then also that just because, again, you agreed to some measure of horseplay or, of just kind of hanging out and being rough doesn't mean that you agreed to sexual contact that came as a result of that.
And when it devolves like that, especially if it devolves like that quickly and you're caught off guard, you can freeze.
Right.
And now we've just come to why it is so important to go back to that definition of consent. That consent isn't just the absence of a no, because the person might be frozen. It needs to be the presence of a yes.
Absolutely.
So sexual assault can affect anyone. And as you said, Amy, I agree with you. It's pretty much a given in my mind that everyone listening today knows at least one person who has been sexually assaulted. How do we respond? And that might be as a person with some type of authority or leadership, or that might just be as a friend. What do we do when we learn that somebody has experienced a sexual assault?
So I think a really important distinction to make in responding, because we're going to talk a little about, I think, reporting it and also responding from a care standpoint. Mandated reporting, which I know has been a conversation previously here on Grace Live Conversations, applies to minor children. And so any states where there are mandated reporting laws, they're going to be, related specifically to minors and abuse that has occurred or assault that has occurred with minors. And so the role of a mandated reporter is to report that in those states. And, I think we've also had conversation around, even if it's not mandated in your state as a clergy person, an ethical and moral responsibility still remains. When someone is no longer a minor, the trauma, the sexual assault that occurs becomes the responsibility of the victim to decide whether or not they want to report that. There are a lot of nuances around that decision, a lot of considerations to be made, but it is really important to know that supporting and walking with the victim as they make that decision, as they go through a process, to report, or if they don't decide to report, that support and care for them is so important. But because sexual assault takes away choice from a person, takes away power, takes away their voice, it's so important for survivors to reclaim that in the way that's best for them. And part of that can be in making a report of their sexual assault, and some of that could be in deciding not to for a variety of reasons. And I think everybody's going to come to a different decision based on what they have going on in their life, what their interaction with and experience has maybe been in the past with the criminal justice system, the risks involved for them in their potentially domestic situation, or, whether or not they want that to go through that process, which may be re-traumatizing, but also may be healing. So there are a lot of factors that a person weighs when they consider whether or not to report their own assault. But regardless of what decision they make, they need the care and support of the people around them to help them in that process, to be a part of that presence, that support as they make that decision, and collaborating with local professionals, connecting with your local rape crisis center, child advocacy center, investigative parties to ask questions about, like, what is the best way to help someone going through this, or what resources are available here that can support them, that we can collaborate on. How can we help pay for some counseling? How can we be a part of supporting and collaborating with local professionals? Can be so key in making decisions around support and reporting and care after the fact.
Yeah. I think, go ahead. It looked like you were going to say something, Amy.
No, I just was going to echo what Laura said, just the importance of providing survivor care. If an individual decides not to report, we're going to talk a little bit about why survivors don't report in a minute. But, when a survivor makes a disclosure, sometimes even just, we stand by you, we support you, whatever choice you make, we're going to be here through it with you, especially if it's church leadership, is really, really can be very powerful. And so that may just be the empowerment that a survivor needs to make a report to law enforcement. In these cases, it's not uncommon where a church leadership will be sitting on the offender side, will be supporting the offender through a criminal case, and the victim side will be very, very sparse. There will be very few people there present, especially from the church or a faith setting. I'm hopeful that that's changing over the years, but as church leadership, it's very important that when a disclosure of sexual assault is made, that the victim is believed and that they are encouraged and told that they will be supported through the process in whatever way they choose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, depending on what occurred and where and within a particular jurisdiction, a survivor could make a report. If they're on a college campus, they have recourse to make a report to their Title IX office there. They could make a report to law enforcement. They could, the military has their own process for handling sexual assault allegations as well. So there's a whole other process there. There's the civil process. So when we talk about even like coming forward and accountability and reporting, there are a variety of avenues depending on where this occurred and the nature of what occurred that could make a difference in what options and choices are available to that person. But, reporting can be very difficult. Retelling your story at a time where you're, just recently been traumatized to anyone, let alone a law enforcement officer who's going to ask a lot of very invasive questions, is hard. And it may not be something someone feels they're ready to do. Again, state by state, the laws are different around statute of limitations, around how long a person can wait before making a report. But what I will describe, if we can take a minute to kind of talk about what happens if someone does make a report or does decide to come forward right after an event, is that there is an opportunity for DNA evidence collection that can occur within a very particular window of time after someone's assault. So if someone's been assaulted, maybe in your community or someone that it might be helpful to know as you're supporting them in their decision-making, that if something happened yesterday, that there's still time for DNA evidence to be collected through a sexual assault exam at their local ER by trained professionals who know how to do that. They can make a report to law enforcement at that time. But in some states, and at least here in the state of South Carolina, I will say that we make space for what we call an anonymous kit to be completed, which is that somebody can go and have that evidence completed shortly after an assault, but that they don't have to make a law enforcement report right away. And that kit can be stored up to a year after that assault. So that gives that person time to sort of process and think through, do I want to go through the criminal justice system for do I want to make a law enforcement report? And I think, that gives somebody that space and time to take a minute, to take a beat and before they make a decision about that, but while preserving the evidence that is collected. But I don't know that that's the case in every state. In many states, there might be a law enforcement report that is made at the time at the hospital that someone goes in for an exam. But there is a particular window of time between 72 and 120 hours, depending on the state, for that DNA evidence to be collected via a rape kit sexual assault exam. And then some states have statute of limitations, right? So some people only have a window of time to make a report. And again, when it comes to an issue of spousal rape here in South Carolina, you only have 30 days to decide to make a report. So your time is limited when it comes to spousal rape, but with every other kind of sexual assault, there's no statute of limitations on reporting. And that can allow, again, a victim some time to think about their decision before making a report, before coming forward. So it's really important to know the laws of your state to understand, can I have an informed decision about what I want to do with this evidence, with my report? And so connecting again with those local resources are so important, because they can advise you. They can advise the person you're supporting, and can even accompany them and provide additional layers of support and advocacy to someone who wishes to make a report, or to someone who doesn't want to make a report and just wants support and help and therapy potentially in the process as well. So, but if something happened longer ago and you still want to, you can make a report to law enforcement. That window of evidence collection is no longer there when it comes to the DNA evidence from the sexual assault exam and the rape kit, but there may be other corroborating evidence that can be used in that case. So it's important, again, collaborate with your local professionals, know what your options are, how to support, what advocacy is available, so that as folks are thinking about how they want to move forward, if they do, with a report, what's available to them, what do they need to know about that?
That sounds great. And I think it's really especially important, as you talked about that, and running into things like a statute of limitations, running into things like this window for collecting evidence, that even if that statute of limitations has passed or a window of collecting evidence has passed, it is still likely very helpful to have someone that you can talk to about what happened. Whether that's, I think, in my opinion, I may be biased, a licensed mental health provider would be very wise, but it could be a spiritual leader, like a pastor or somebody like that, who understands and gets this. It could be a close friend or family member who understands and gets this. And so even if a statute of limitations or a window for collecting evidence may have passed, it still could be very helpful to connect with somebody as you work through and process what happened.
Absolutely. And Amy, I think you can even speak to this a little bit more, but, for a lot of the people that I've worked with and that the agency that I works with, most of them aren't finding healing in the justice system. That's not where their healing is found. Their healing is a much longer, lifelong process, but much of it found, in that support, in the therapy that they're doing, because, the justice system is a really tricky place, and it's not trauma informed, and it may not bring the outcome that you hope. And you need support to navigate that. And you also need support to navigate how to go forward into your future of healing, with or without what you hope from the justice system. And so at that, talking with someone, that support, having access to those resources is so important. And I know that they're not available in every single community that people might be in, but they are available in many communities. And so I really hope that folks will reach out to what is available locally to explore that, to explore those resources a little bit more for those around them.
One of the things that we've talked about a few times here is this idea of disclosing, whether it's disclosing as part of your processing, whether it's disclosing as part of trying to engage with the justice system. But a lot of times, a person who has experienced a sexual assault doesn't come forward and report, not just doesn't come forward and report to authorities, but doesn't come forward and tell anyone often. And it ends up being this burden that a person carries alone.
Mm-hmm.
Can you help us understand what gets in the way of letting people know, what gets in the way of making that outcry of reporting what happened?
Yeah, sure. I think there's a lot of factors for why people don't report. Concern for not being believed. A lot of survivors that I've spoken with will tell me that, well, what happened to me just wasn't that bad. I know people who've experienced something far greater than what I went through. And so they, and that their experience wasn't traumatic enough, or fear of retaliation. I see this a lot in really in church cultures where there's a high purity teaching, purity culture, where people will not disclose sexual assault because they'll, the idea of purity, that sex before marriage is wrong, that they'll fear retaliation, that they are somehow tarnished as a result, embarrassment or shame, a misunderstanding of what constitutes sexual assault and consent. I see this a lot, and I also see this a lot with child sexual abuse too, as Laura kind of mentioned earlier. A misunderstanding of their own behavior or responses during the abuse or the assault, a trauma response such as fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And so, when someone does disclose, that's why it's really important to get them to local resources that can really help a survivor understand trauma responses and understand what constitutes sexual assault and consent, so they can really start to process what really occurred to them. I think that assumptions about conditions and environments and circumstances such as alcohol use, flirting, environmental factors, a lot of these environments misplace responsibility on the survivors. Another way to say that is, victim blaming. And so I think that is something that really prevents people from reporting. Sometimes maybe a survivor tried to casually put something out there. Maybe it wasn't a full disclosure. Maybe it was just like a small little test, and the test did not go well. There was some victim blaming, or that culture and environment really, language around that culture and environment was used that really kind of put the survivor on notice that they would not be believed. And so they kind of recluse and decide, I'm not going to tell. This is not a safe environment to do so. Lack of training in law enforcement on how to interview victims of abuse. Unfortunately, I see this a lot, way more than I would like to admit. And as a result, there's re-traumatized. The reporting process, as Laura has mentioned, can be re-traumatizing. It's really unfortunate that even law enforcement doesn't always understand trauma and how to be victim-centered. And so that can prevent survivors from reporting. And also the criminal process can take a very long time. And someone may feel that the cost to themselves or even to others, like their close family members, a parent, a sibling, maybe it's just too great. Another reason that I think is really, just casually would like to mention is that sometimes the survivor may greatly care about the offender. Maybe if it's a family member or a very close friend, or if it is someone that they were in an intimate partner relationship with, they may also care about that person, and they don't want to disclose for that reason. I think it's important to mention the statistic. I've known about the statistic for a long time, and it really is staggering that out of every 1,000 instances of rape, only 13 cases get referred to a prosecutor. And only 7 cases will lead to a felony conviction. Those are really, really saddening statistics, but it is important to note that reporting does increase the likelihood that the perpetrator will face some kind of a consequence. So, as Laura mentioned, some survivors view reporting as an important part of their healing process in pursuit of justice, and then others do not. And so really it just depends on the survivor and allowing the person to really make that decision for themselves if they're going to report or not, and then supporting them through that process if they do decide to report.
Yes. I want to go back to Amy's first point about, or maybe second, there was a great list there of reasons, barriers really, that people feel to coming forward and disclosing. And one is a comparison of experiences. And one thing I try to really reiterate quite a bit is like, life is not the trauma Olympics. It's not about, was my sexual trauma enough of a sexual trauma to warrant help and counseling and support and advocacy? All people's experiences matter. All pain matters. And I think sometimes people feel like what they went through, quote unquote, doesn't count. But I'm just here to say that it does. And so maybe if anyone out there is feeling that way or has wondered, like, does what happened to me and the way that I'm affected by that, is that really that big of a deal? And I'm here to say that what you went through is important and it matters. It matters to Grace. It matters to those of us in the field who we're here to validate that what you went through, your sexual assault matters. In case you haven't heard that from anybody else, I'm going to tell you that. Because we can easily devolve into this comparison game. But, sometimes when I run groups, I think one of the most powerful aspects of getting a group of people together for healing is that they realize I'm not the only one. What I went through does matter. I had no idea that anyone else had been through what I've been through. And that, look at all these people at different points in their healing process. Like, we can do this, So I just want to make sure that I say that that if you've been through some form of sexual assault, that it matters and you deserve healing just like anybody else.
Laura, I'm going to say this too, and maybe you can help me say this like in the most trauma-informed therapist way. But I have this conversation a lot with survivors, and that is, well, if I don't report, like, are there other survivors? Like, especially with child sexual abuse, but it also happens with adult sexual assault. Like, if I don't report, maybe there will be other survivors, or maybe someone who's didn't report initially and is now wrestling with if they should report, and they're feeling guilt if there's other survivors out there and they didn't report, as if it's their fault that there might be other victims. And I just want to say to anybody listening to this that your sexual assault or someone else's sexual assault is not your fault. That is the fault of the offender and the offender only. So whether you choose to report or not, and there's other victims, it's not that has to be your decision with your therapist and with your counselors and your trusted advisors. If reporting is in what's your best interest, and then, any other individuals who may have been impacted. Again, something you have to work through with your trusted advisors, but I just really want to say that because I know it's something that we all, struggle with that situation. So, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that's great. And I think one of the hardest things about sexual assault and sexual abuse is that, you already didn't ask for something to happen. You didn't ask for something to happen, and you lose so much. When that happens, you lose power, you lose a sense of self, you can lose a sense of worth, time, resources, the ability to connect with other people. There are so many losses that come with trauma, and sexual traumas specifically. And then to add the guilt on top of that, you didn't ask for this to happen, and you didn't ask to be made responsible for anybody else either. And so I think that can weigh very heavily on a person for sure. But I want to definitely back you up here, Amy. It's not your fault, and then you didn't cause this, and you didn't cause it to yourself or to anybody else.
Right. Before we transition to questions and answers, one thing that I do want to mention, especially for any person who has a position of leadership or authority. You may be working with the person that reveals to you that there has been a sexual assault. That person may be choosing not to go to the authorities. The authorities may have said that they can't pursue the matter. The statute of limitations may have expired, but for one reason or another, the authorities are not acting. That doesn't mean there's nothing for you to do. Mm-hmm. You still can and have a responsibility to put safeguards in place to care for that person and for the entire congregation or the entire organization. Just because the authorities are not getting involved, whether that's because of the adult survivor's choice or because of some limitations within the system, that does not mean that you are excused from action. You must still act.
Mm-hmm. You know, I think an important distinction I often talk with people about related to the criminal justice system is, there's different standards of evidence for the criminal justice system and the civil process and other things. But the criminal justice system's job is to determine, is there enough evidence to support this claim, right? So even if the criminal justice system returns a not guilty verdict, it doesn't mean it didn't happen. It means there isn't enough evidence that meets the standard of evidence for there to be a guilty verdict to convince a jury. And I think some people really struggle with that. And I acknowledge that it does create a lot of challenge and tension for people when they think about that, because it is what our nation has, right, as its system to handle these cases. But it is very much based on standard of evidence. And one of the most difficult things about these cases is that a lot of the evidence that would meet that standard isn't available. And so that's very difficult for people, for cases to be prosecuted, for cases to be investigated, and for people to return a verdict. Even jurors that say, I think this person did it and I can't convict them because the evidence doesn't tell me that I can. So I just want to say that that can be part of the challenge with this criminal justice system particularly.
All right. That's great. That's great. Well, thank you for this really engaging and powerful conversation. We have a couple of questions that have come in that we will try and address. I'm guessing that there will be some questions that we don't get to as well, and we'll try and respond within the next few weeks to those questions that may come in that we don't have a chance to respond to here today. One of the questions that's come in is, what are some tips for leaders when a victim decides not to report or when law enforcement fails? So we were talking about that some, but what are some specific actions that leaders may be able to do?
I mean, I think that supporting a victim through their trauma, connecting them to local resources, it's really important that church leadership find out who your local resources are and develop relationships with them. So that could be the Rape Crisis Center, that could be a child advocacy center. Some local advocacy centers, I know Laura's does this, also has resources for adults, not just children. And so a child advocacy center can be a really great resource, and they can also point you in some positive directions. Your local law enforcement, and I say have a relationship with your local law enforcement so that they can help you in these types of situations. So not so that you can develop a relationship to try to help schmooze people out of, criminal activity. And then, just other local resources. And then just, helping them get connected to a therapist. Sometimes churches can really be pivotal in providing financial assistance for survivors and getting therapy. I will just say, if a church decides to do this, that it needs to be autonomous. Like the survivor needs to have full autonomy to discern who his or her therapist will be And that does not need to be determined by the church. I know some churches, they'll be like, well, we're only going to pay for it if it's a Christian counselor. We're only going to pay for it if you use this list of people, really giving agency to a survivor to pick who they want their therapist to be, and providing financial resources for that is
providing as many choices as possible, really. I mean, again, what's taken away in sexual trauma, that power, voice, those choices is part of what we need to do when we're caring. We need to restore those things. We need to offer those things. What are opportunities for them to share their story in a safe environment? How can we support that? How can we give them as many choices as possible, and what resources they interact with, and what they choose to participate in, even in a local congregation, and how can we show them that we believe them and act in trustworthy ways so that they feel so that they can begin to feel a sense of safety in connecting with the community that they're a part of. I kind of interrupted you, Amy. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I mean, I think that's all too. And I don't know if you mentioned this, but removing the barriers to reporting, that really does come with education and training of your staff and leadership of what is sexual assault, what is child sexual abuse, and how do we properly respond.
And I think if there are any pastors listening, a lot of the themes that survivors struggle with, whether adult sexual assault or child sexual abuse, we see this across the board, are feelings of responsibility, of internalizing fault and the shame that comes with that, the shame about what they went through, the shame of not telling, the shame of feeling responsible, lack of safety, a lack of trust. And so as you're even thinking about how you interact with your faith communities and congregations and congregants and community members, how can you be a part of safety in articulating that, that it isn't their fault, that, what they went through matters, that you believe them, that you want the faith community to be a safe place and can acknowledge that it's not been sometimes. A lot of those themes come up for survivors. And I think there's a lot of ways to reflect on those as a faith community and think about how can we be a part of doing better, right? And being safe, trustworthy places and spaces and people for survivors.
Yeah.
Super. Sorry, Pete. I was just going to say, I think a lot of times I've seen this in Christian environments where, as Christians, we believe that the Bible can solve all problems and that there's a verse that can help us get through anything. And while that might be true to some extent, when someone discloses abuse, giving them a Bible verse and slapping a verse on it and being like, God's going to get you through this is probably not the wisest answer. And so I would just really encourage pastors not to. What I would do is it's called spiritual bypassing, of kind of it's okay, God's going to get you through this, and really that's just not a trauma-informed response. And so making sure that when there is a disclosure, that any spiritual help that they're receiving, any scriptural guidance that they're giving is done in a trauma-informed way. And I would say the only way that that's trauma-informed is if they're in some sort of trauma-informed survivor group that's guided through that process, rather than just coming from someone who doesn't understand trauma and scripture and how it affects, because that can also cause spiritual abuse and more harm. So
yeah. RAINN has a search by location zip code search, I think, for local rape crisis centers. So if you are looking for how do I connect with a local center, rape crisis center specifically, which would be working with adult victims of sexual assault, RAINN, the website, I think that has been posted here in the chat, does have a way for you to search by zip code to find local hotline numbers and local resources in that way.
All right. Great. Thank you both for sharing your wisdom, your insights, your experience. It's really been an engaging conversation, a helpful conversation, an essential conversation. For those of you who are interested, next month, our Grace Live conversation is going to be focused on sexual harassment. So we'll have a guest joining us next month as we discuss sexual harassment. We had questions that we were not able to get to today. We'll do our best to respond to those within the next couple of weeks. If you did not get a chance to post a question or another question comes to your mind after we finish today's program, please feel free to email us at info@netgrace.org. If you have other questions about Grace, please check out our website, www.netgrace.org. And if you want to view this program later, within a few days, we'll have it posted on our YouTube channel, and you'll be able to view it there, as well as other past Grace Live conversations. Thank you again for joining us today, for participating in this conversation. I pray that the rest of your day will go well and that you'll have a good weekend. Thanks, everyone. Bye.